there's no genre in painting about which artists have written and discussed so much as abstract art. Nevertheless, it remains a completely misunderstood phenomenon for many people. It's therefore logical that it's a good idea to start to introduce abstract art, at least as I see it, especially because this demonstrates the many possibilities of abstract art for our Art Start Stories series. And I'm thinking not only of stories, but especially of poetry, as will become clear later. My name is Roby, and I helped out the Vietnamese Đà Nẵng Art for Children Gallery. As the son of an artist, I've lived my whole life surrounded by paintings in progress, paintings that will never be finished, all kinds of paintings. This introduced me to the challenge of being an artist in all sorts of ways. I was also admitted to the Art Academy in Antwerp, but after a short time I decided that presenting art rather than creating it was that suited me the best. My starting point is not the usual art offerings, but rather the question of how we can stimulate interest in art. An Art Start Story is one of my projects. Writing your own story helps you to learn a foreign language. Because not everybody is brimming with story ideas, I thought it might be helpful to start with the usual illustration. An existing artwork can be very helpful. However, you do need to be able to use it. So I created a series of videos that help teachers and supervisors to use art to create a story. And this is already the 5th in the series. I conceived this project for the Vietnamese Đà Nẵng Arts for Children. Developing an interest in art is something you should start early with. So I was one of the first to exhibit art specifically created for children, connecting to their world of experience and very practical at their eye level, as Juliet DeWitt vividly illustrated. So no art for adults explained to children, just as you don't get children excited about books by reading and explaining Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Books written specifically for children are much better suited for this. And why should art, visual art, be any different? So I not only stage exhibitions but also open the first art lending library for children. A library not for books but for art. So because I focus on the public, I have a very different approach than most art experts who focus on the art on offer. They know a lot about art. I'm more interested in why the public often reacts very different, like to abstract art than to figurative art. Maybe the most frequently asked question is probably, what does it represent? And that's a very interesting question. But still, it's a question one doesn't ask when seeing a flower in nature, for example. One doesn't ask, what does this represent? So why would one ask about an abstract work of art? That people don't see painting as a painting, but more as a data carrier. And that was the situation for centuries, until the invention of photography. The principle of photography was already known in the early 19th century, but it was until the late 19th century that photography began to develop to a significant degree. But much more was happening around the turn of the century. The introduction of the automobile, the Wright brothers' first flight, the invention of the radio and the telephone. And speaking about telephony, it's often said that young people are smarter than older people, and that's a fact, that's true. But older people have more experience. So I'm from the first half of the last century, and The first time I was involved with using a telephone was with this type. You turn the handle on the right and someone from the switchboard answered. So young people look interested while I explain it, but what do they do with my experience? I wouldn't know, and neither they would. In each case, all those developments around the turn of the century not only profoundly changed society, but during that same period, art also distanced itself from traditional art. World War I was even more drastic. Not only was it one of the deadliest conflicts in history, but it was above all the absurd way in which war was waged and the senseless sacrifice of soldiers that had enormous impact on society and to a very great extent to the art world. And it's these developments that are partly responsible for the absurd prices paid for modern art today. Yes, this might sound a bit strange, but sometimes it seems if artists are more interested in money and fame than in creating art. However, looking back, this is a completely logical development. With the invention of photography, the production of classic documentary art was disappearing, and thus also the usual reason for people to buy art. Previously, the task of a work of art was primarily to depict a portrait or landscape or as realistic as possible. That was no longer necessary. Under the influence of these and all the other changes, artists began to ask themselves, what is my task as an artist? Is painting only there to accurately depict something, or can a painting reveal much more? Should I paint a landscape as it is or as it feels? How do I portray the horrors of war? Well, what happens when I depict a person, not as they appear, but as they appear to me? And they tried this out in practice, leading to interesting, entirely new ways of paintings. One of the most famous modern painters is Picasso. He's often spoken condescendingly, usually by those who have seen some of his later work and assume, well, he cannot paint classically. But he was already a master of classical painting when he was still a teenager. Picasso painted this work when he was only 16. He was one of those artists who, as a result of all those changes, developed very rapidly. We see this in this portrait Picasso painted of one of his gallery owners, the portrait of Mr. D.H. Kahnweiler. He painted in 1910, not so much more than 10 years later than the one he painted very classically. Whether this work appeals to you or not, it's clearly a completely different kind of work. And that was also the case for the art created by other modernists. They too faced some major problems because as an artist, ultimately, they had to make a living from selling their paintings. There was an existing market for the classic work, but for this new work, which they were still inventing, there was no market at all. The work itself didn't exist yet. So they weren't just exploring new forms of presentations, they also had to develop a new market. And those are two completely different things. They also had to sell themselves to that new market, because you can talk about your work in a very engaging way, and they did, but primarily with other artists. They organized conferences about the new art, produced magazines, and above all, they made a lot of art. But television had yet to be invented, and promoting visual art via radio is difficult. And those journalists weren't always aware of what was being made and why. That's why, for example, some painting styles were much more accessible than others. Action painting, for example, in particular. It's very accessible for, especially if, as the French artist Georges Mathieu put it, you have to paint incredibly fast and quickly, because if it took longer, it was no longer spontaneous. Well, that sounds very logical and understandable regardless of the result. So he painted a youth painting in less than half an hour. And then the attention of the press and the public was focused on that, especially because in this case, creating and explaining an art creators required little time and understanding. Even today, you have people like Damien Hirst, who is incredibly good in selling himself and his art. Someone else hangs a banana in a museum and sells it for millions. For me, this is like millions being paid for somebody who can kick a ball around on football. As with many things that are rare and sometimes original and that attract wealthy, those prices skyrocket. But for me, that's why the financial value of a work of art is separate from its artistic value. The situation used to be that the artist had to be primarily a craftsman. Now they also had to explain to the public the theory behind the new art, as well as the artworks themselves, and that simply works better when you yourself have a clear image of an artist. And some artists excelled at that. Some artists' ideas were interesting, while other artworks were very interesting, but they didn't receive press attention because, for example, they are women. Others' art was particularly special, but their presentation certainly was. And some simply had everything going for them, like someone like Picasso. So a clear audience for the searching and experimenting artist emerged. And a popular image of this artist around the turn of the century was that he preferred to live in Paris, had no money but many women, and wasn't a social role model, the opposite. The stories behind the artist became increasingly important selling points, often more important than the art itself, as Claire Gold, who lived among the artists, masterfully described in her book The Poursuite du Vent, the Vent's Suit. Not only in Paris, but elsewhere, people learned to sell themselves and their art. And as the market grew, that type naturally evolved. The advent of social media certainly wasn't made things any easier for the average artist. In the past, they were also amateur artists. Some were very good, but found the artist's life too precarious, making it very difficult to reach interested parties. That's much easier now. They're literally overwhelmed by the sublime. This new way of painting led to a very, very diverse range of works. For this video, I want to limit myself to a few interesting forms of abstract art. Opinions are still divided on what exactly constitutes abstract art. A simple but clear definition, in my opinion, is that one cannot see what an abstract work represents. It's the opposite of a concrete work. This is essentially means that an artist who works abstractly doesn't need to be able to draw people. The artists use their own visual language to convey feelings and ideas. Using color and shapes, viewers are invited to create their own interpretation of what they see. So now let's look at the definition of what poetry is. It's a form of literature in which words are carefully chosen and arranged to evoke thoughts, feelings and images, not only through their literal meaning, but also through sound, rhythm, imaginary, and the conscious design of the text on the page. It's clear that the definitions for abstract art and poetry are very similar. So let's take a look at where I see similarities. Where we see these similarities very clearly is in Dadaist art and the concrete poem. Dadaist art often features text while concrete poem in turn is very visual oriented. Dadaism referred to the infantile language Dada, Dada, is arose because artists began to rebel against what especially the army commanders advocated. This was direct opposition by creating absurd art, often incorporate text, as we see here in Hannah Höch's work from 1919. Cut with a kitchen knife, Dada, through the last Weimar barely cultural epoch in Germany. By the title. It's been over 50 years since the International Cultural Center in Antwerp presented a major retrospective featuring the work of the Flemish poet Paul van Ostaaien, who died in 1928. Seeing his work was a breath of fresh air for me, completely different from the mundane, lengthy poetry that emphasized things I wasn't interested in at all. I lived in the era of Jimi Hendrix and Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and the protest against colonization, and their lyrics resonated much better with me, or what appealed to me. And then in the intercultural centrum in Antwerp spaces, where normally paintings hang, one of Van Ostaayen's famous poem hang there in a large format, and it's called Boom, Paukenslag, and everything's flat. Oh. Interesting. It was precisely around the time of that exhibition that graffiti emerged, a pure blend of visual art and concrete poetry. These are photos from the Fat Cap Express, a 2008 film about the Rotterdam graffiti scene. For some unknown reason, I was asked to play the police officer who had to arrest the graffiti artists. During the filming, I learned quite a bit about an art form that turned out to be much more interesting than I had previously thought. Well, just like with abstract art. So, although it seems very simple, writing concrete poetry is certainly not easy. It's not just about the form, but also about the content of the text, and one must consider both form and content in individual word choices. Therefore, it helps considerably to expand your vocabulary and to discover that words can have different meanings and to utilize them. Another work that fits here is that of Yoya Kusama. I could have mentioned her among the child-friendly authors because our curator Gulia, as a part of her work, gave a workshop in the Art for Children gallery, and the polka dots actively seem to keep the children enthusiastic. In fact, not only children. Kusama started drawing them herself when she was 10. They are shaped like the sun and the moon and are very poetic. And it remains fascinating to see how artists can create beautiful and sometimes joyful art from personal struggles. In her best-known poetry book, Every Day a Prayer for Love, she writes very personal about her creative process. The near opposite of Dadaist art is what I will call the analytical abstract art of Piet Mondrian, among others. Its hallmark is that it in no way refers to any figuration, and it's completely emotionless. The artist explores the plane and how the parts within it relate to each other. Personally, I often compare this art to beautiful crafted and fascinated industrial objects. This way of working is therefore closely related to the architecture of the renewed Bauhaus Art Center, like this material exercises in paper by Walter Trollow and Ariane Saron from 1928. But the famous Kandinsky also taught at the Bauhaus, and he's credited with saying that form is only one possible expression of the inner self. And this statement leads me from Piet Mondrian to Barnett Newman, who created a series of 4 paintings, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue. Each painting features a large red surface complemented by thin yellow and blue lines. Outwardly, it appears to follow Mondrian's style, but Newman saw it as a confrontation with Mondrian, who approached the combination of colors very didactically rather than from a free expression. One of those works hung in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, where I worked as an attendant at that time. My interest in abstract art also arose there. One of the rooms where I spent hours was filled with the work of Kazimir Malevich. When I first started working there, I thought abstract art was nonsense. I'd always been told it was made by people who couldn't paint. But when you walk among them day after day and work after work shows you how Malevich evolved from a very traditional painting to a complete abstract white surface on white from 1918, the final work becomes perfect, logical. Over time, I also came to appreciate other abstract works, but Newman's didn't appeal to me. It was large and red, and that was it. Until it was damaged and restored. Then it turned out that the restoration of the large red area had been done with a roller, while it was originally painted with a brush. So you will perceive the lightning shining on it differently as you walk past it. I never noticed that, probably because I didn't know. But later, when I did know, but it was no longer visible due to the restoration, I began to see the work very differently. Well, there are several reasons why this way of creating art reminds me of haiku. Firstly, because the haiku, like analytical abstract art, reduces what is being presented to its essence. The form is also very strict in its image. There are always 3 lines of characters with fixed 5-7-5 structure. In English, where a different script is used, is about the number of syllables. Interestingly, the haiku, unlike Mondrian's vision, does like Newman's aims for an emotional response. It often refers to nature, which wasn't the case in Mondrian's work. Incidentally, Mondrian painted many flowers painting to earn money, and he was very good at it. But in his Paris studio, he also had a single flower in a vase. But he painted it entirely green, or was it white? I forgot that. The art form that certainly fits with it is minimal art, such as that of the American artist Agnes Martin. The thumbnail used for this video is work by Ad Arma. An abstract painting simply represents an abstract work of art, and that is precisely what makes it so incredibly interesting for someone who needs inspiration to write a story, because while figurative work pushes you in a certain direction, an abstract work leaves you completely free. But that enormous freedom the artist had to paint without condition also gives enormous freedom to those who want to practice the new language. And I believe that freedom can be found in poetry. And it works the other way around too. Someone whose work was often inspired by poetry was John Mitchell, which paints kind like this painting. It's kind of dancing like poetry. They could all be poems. They just had to be written. In my landscape video, I discussed Daphne Nassel's color plane theory, creating depth through color, not perspective. A striking example of this is work by Julie Mehretu, Hineni Eye. This layering can also be created in poetry in all sorts of ways. For example, one can write alternately sentences where the first sentence always has a dark tone due to the word choice, while the next sentence sounds very light, also due to the word choice. So there are an incredibly number of works in expressionist abstract art, just as there are in the field of free verse poetry. This work, however, is an example of a beautiful expressionist abstract painting created in 1952 by Audrey Flack. The title, Abstract Force, Homage to Franz Klein, 1952. Well, it refers to Franz Klein, who evolved from figurative to abstract expression, and then he became a teacher also. He was one of the artists of the American Action Painting Group, which I will discuss later. The reason I'm showing Flack's work is not only because I think it's really beautiful, but also because it's a kind of work that constantly leaves you with new insights. But Flack is also a typical example of what I started with at the beginning of this video, that it was incredibly difficult for artists, especially in that era, to communicate with viewers through their work. For Flack, it was the reason to completely change direction, and she became one of the first new realists with her photorealistic work. It's very interesting when you see that super realistic work and you compare it with her abstract work from before. It's very familiar for me. Typical for artists who practice action painting is that they often express themselves in many art forms, such as the Portuguese artist Anna Hatherley, who also wrote engaging poetry and made films. Probably the most famous action painting artist is Jackson Pollock, about whom an excellent Great Art Explained video was made. Perhaps most interesting is that Pollock became world famous for his dripping technique. The work lies on the floor and the paint drips from the brush. But it wasn't Pollock who pioneered this dripping technique, but the Ukrainian artist Janet Sobel, and as I noted earlier, interest in female artists was very limited, if any at all. Therefore, it's good that this video about Pollock corrects the history, because she was very interesting artist. She has to be remembered. The Art Start Story project was developed by the Art for Children Gallery. Therefore, I can't avoid talking about child-friendly abstract, and in particular, what constitutes child-friendly art. It's actually quite simple. It's art that connects as closely as possible with a child's perception of the world. But since all children are different, the art we're dealing with is very different. So, is there also non-child-friendly art? Certainly. There's a lot of art that depicts things children aren't developmentally ready for, even with guidance. Some people advocate for complete freedom of choice, and I agree with that, provided a selection item has been made first. Compare it with food. Freedom of choice is wonderful, but not if there are also poisonous berries on the table. So, fortunately, there is more than enough choice. There's art specifically created for children, and those artists have extensive experience with what children are interested in, what's going on in their life, day and night. In addition, there is art made by artists who often work with children, and precisely among the range of abstract art, there's a lot of art that is suitable for children. Take these two works by Ernst Wilhelm Ney. I don't know what they represent, but I enjoy looking at them. They're very rhythmic and inviting to see all sorts of things and stories in them. This is called Mit roten und schwarzen Punkten. Yeah, it's a good title. It has rote and zwarte Punkten. And what are they doing? Remember the story of the yellow and blue. And in this difference with his other painting, Accord in Rood and Blauw. It's very different. It also leads to a very different other kind of poetry. And they seem to me well suited to acrostic poetry, where the first letters of each sentence form a word of expression. Well, there's a lot of abstract art that's very accessible to children, and that's because the abstract word doesn't represent anything, which doesn't lead to problematic discussions. The artist whose work I personally find beautiful, light-hearted and engaging is from the American Seymour Boardman. Abstract art has evolved from depicting the figurative, what we see, to depicting what we experience, what we feel. It's a search for a new language that parallels familiar languages, and in a sense poetry often pushes boundaries within language. I didn't talk a lot about poetry itself. I think in this case the paintings, they give so many possibilities for writing poetry. It wasn't really necessary. So thanks for watching. If you found it interesting or having any comments, please let us know. And subscribing is always a good thing. See you in a possible next video.